Okay, thank you very much, Sharon. Good morning, colleagues. Thank you very much for joining us for this press conference. We are going to present an assessment of our findings in terms of media's coverage of the whole election period from proclamation, and our study started on the 31st of May and we ended on the 22nd of July. In our assessment, we focused on the nature of election coverage during the election period, and we focused on three main issues. The first issue was how fair and how balanced was the coverage of political players. The second was how the media has been able to provide information to the public. And the third looked at the professional and ethical conduct of the media in covering elections. In the final assessment, I think just broadly, we concluded that while the election agenda dominated in all media platforms, and there was quite a bit of information on the elections, coverage of political players was largely unbalanced, and it favored established political parties, especially ZANU-PF. Looking at the fairness and the balance of coverage of political players, like I indicated, the coverage was biased towards the President Emmerson Mnangagwa and ZANU-PF, and it was very unfair to the main opposition and smaller political parties. We noted, for example, that in total, if you look at all the media that we monitored, which is from the private press, the public press, ZBC, national commercial radio stations and local commercial radio stations, ZANU-PF had a total of 53% of all coverage, which was very biased towards the party. And the closest anyone else came to matching that was MDC Alliance, which had 20% of the total coverage. Of course, there were differences in terms of how the different publications, the different broadcast media reported on political players, but this was the general trend. There was also very limited diversity in the representation of political parties. We noted that the top 10 political parties that were covered, that is ZANU-PF, MDC Alliance, APA, MDCT, PRC, Build and Code, were covered in 92% of the coverage. That meant that of the 55 political parties that were contesting in the election, they probably shared the remaining 8%, which we thought was very unfair. As I indicated, in the coverage of presidential candidates, the 23 of them, when we looked at how much coverage there was, 57% was actually for Emmerson Mnangagwa, and Nelson Chamisa was covered in 15% of that coverage. There was quite a bit of discrepancy, especially in the public media. When I'm saying the public, the state-owned press, specifically the Herald, Chronicle, Sunday Mail, which we monitored, where 80% of everything that was talking about political players was on Emmerson Mnangagwa, 15% on Nelson Chamisa. We also looked at how the media covered political players in terms of the tone and how neutral they have been in covering political players. What we noted was that while coverage was predominantly neutral, ZANU-PF and MDC received a higher percentage of either positive or negative sentiment than any other party. ZANU-PF was predominantly covered positively in government-controlled media and ZBC. There was very negative coverage of MDC Alliance and government media. When we looked at private media, they carried both positive and negative sentiment of the two political parties in almost equal measure. So in terms of how the media has been covering political players and the tone of coverage, we have noted that skewed coverage, especially in terms of the negativity against opposition players and the positive coverage for the ruling party. We also looked at gender representation in election programs and noted that women were underrepresented in election coverage, and in this whole period that we looked at, there was only 11% coverage of women political players as compared to 89%. We note that most of the visibility actually came from national commercial radio stations, that is Star FM and ZFM, who covered the, women in 28% of their programs. The tone of coverage for women was, however, very neutral and positive. But of note, of course, was that when women were actually featured in election programs, they would do so on women-related issues. For example, if there was the program around women's participation, that's where you'd see women talking about issues in the media. Otherwise, they were largely ignored. We also noted that the representation of youth in the news was very marginal. Of the political players who were able to determine their ages, there was just 4% of coverage of actors who were below 34 years. Although we have noted that there has been quite a large number of registered voters who are young and below 34. In terms of the media's role in informing the public, I had indicated.
Good morning, colleagues. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Sharon Mawoni. I'm the Programs Assistant for Media Monitors. Today we're here to present our Media Monitoring Pre-Election Assessment Report. To my left is our Director, Patience Zirima, and Patience Zirima, our Director, and Priscil Samu, the Senior Researcher. Over to you, Patience.
Okay, thank you very much, Sharon. Good morning, colleagues. Thank you very much for joining us for this press conference. We are going to present an assessment of our findings in terms of media's coverage of the whole election period from proclamation, and our study started on the 31st of May. And if we looked at the overall coverage, we note in the broadcast media, like I indicated, there was only 4% in broadcast media, but overall in the press, political adverts made up 11% of total coverage of political players, as compared to news, which made up about 73%. Maybe just to look a little bit at political advertising, there was an overwhelming predominance of ZANU-PF adverts on all radio stations and ZTV. There were adverts from only 4 players were observed on radio and television. Election regulations on the media state that stations of a public broadcaster should allocate at least 4 hours of available airtime during an election period for election advertisements, which shall be distributed equitably to political parties and candidates contesting in an election. However, we noted the predominance of ZANU-PF, and we made an assumption here that it was probably because of the cost of the advertising. ZBC, for example, had about 6,483 seconds of adverts for ZANU-PF, and there was quite a substantial amount in the national commercial radio stations and the local commercial radio stations. During this period, we only had one independent candidate who had some airtime on local commercial radio station and ZBC, a few or 1 or 2 on the MDC Alliance, and another from NCA. To notice that there has been more adverts that we have seen from opposition political parties after the 22nd, but up to the 22nd, we noted that there was very limited adverts that were coming out as compared to those from the ruling party. In the press, we had a similar trend where we find that 3 political parties or 3 political players, that is ZANU-PF, the MDC Alliance, and an independent candidate, actually produced adverts for the print media, which we found to be quite unfair in terms of how there were some parties who were able to produce adverts and some who were not. We counted a total of about 22 adverts in print media, and 20 of these were actually on the incumbent President Emmerson Mnangagwa, and the other 2 were on other candidates from ZANU-PF. When we look at news coverage, ZANU-PF and MDC Alliance dominated news coverage in broadcast media, with ZANU-PF overwhelmingly dominating coverage on ZBC. When we looked at ZBC News and current affairs programs, we found that ZBC had around 80% of all the airtime on political players, and the next highest was the MDC Alliance, which only had 9%, and the other political parties had to share the remaining 11%. In terms of the media's agenda in this election, we noted that the narratives developed by the government-controlled media and private media show distinct differences about the perceptions on the election environment, the credibility of the election administration body to run the elections, prospects for a free, fair, and credible election, and perceptions on the different political parties. The state-controlled public media and public media presented a picture of an election process that is running smoothly, that is credible. We have a credible electoral commission, a peaceful environment, and a democratic and inclusive ZANU-PF. However, when they looked at the MDC, they presented a violent, undemocratic, and unreasonable opposition. These media that is the public media, present the official voice of the Electoral Commission, the government, and ZANU-PF on election issues. On the other hand, when we looked at the election agenda by the private media, particularly in the print sector, these have raised red flags on various issues on the bias of the Electoral Commission and their ability to run a credible election. They looked at issues of intra- and inter-party violence by the two biggest political parties, as well as their various election promises to the electorate. The opposing narratives by the media have intensified from the first week of the election period to date. I'll just won't read through the whole statement. It will be made available to you. However, I'll look now at the media's conduct in covering the election. What we noted overall, as I had indicated earlier, is that coverage has been very unbalanced. As indicated, of the parties that received media coverage, ZANU-PF accounted for more than half of the coverage, making up 52% of all the space and time recorded on political players. The second issue was around the partisan nature of the coverage of the main political parties. Despite the illusion that there was neutrality in most of the reports that were there was more sentiment that was directed towards the main political parties, that is the MDC Alliance and ZANU-PF. Overall, the two parties accounted for 83% of all the negative sentiment that came out in the media and 72% of all the positive sentiment. This is an indication of the media's bias for or against the two political parties. In terms of the opinions analysis in the media, we noted that these were excessively biased for or against one political party. The different news outlets featured columnists, analysts, and sources that supported the media outlets' editorial stance on certain issues. In the government-controlled press, most of the columnists who commented on political issues praised ZANU-PF and were overly critical of the MDC Alliance. They contributed to most of the MDC Alliance's negative coverage. Another issue was the one-sided nature of sourcing patterns that lacked a lot of the diversity that we would expect in election reporting. These sourcing patterns were common in news articles, particularly those where election disputes were discussed. The stories which these cases were reported were usually one-sided, with the privately owned media documenting MDC Alliance's claims, whilst ZEC's responses were mostly documented in the government-controlled media. It was very rare for a single story to contain perspectives of ZEC and that of the MDC Alliance at the same time, which would have given a fairer picture of the different groups, where the different groups stand. There was also a major issue in which there was a failure to distinguish between government activities and campaign activities, especially by ZANU-PF in the state media. Reports in the state media tended to blur the lines between government activities and ZANU-PF campaigns. ZANU-PF has gained mileage from a lot of launches, tours, official openings by government officials who are in government. These events tilted the playing field in favor of ZANU-PF, as they usually coincided with the party's campaign activities in a particular location, or where they were presided over by a government official who is also running for the election this coming Monday. From the manner in which these reports were covered, it was very difficult to distinguish whether government officials were acting in their official capacity or they were campaigning for ZANU-PF. In conclusion, the coverage of this election has been dominated by ZANU-PF in all respects, from news reporting, current affairs, and advertising. The nature of coverage has largely disadvantaged less established political parties, who have not managed to get as much media attention and have failed to take up any offered advertising space to market their parties. While opposition parties, particularly the MDC Alliance, received more favorable coverage in private media were also relatively balanced in terms of how they were representing the ruling party. Challenges in the media's performance during the election period we thought were deeply rooted in the political economy of the media. The dynamics in media ownership contributed immensely to the reporting patterns, where we saw government-controlled media with an obvious bias towards the ruling party and a great disdain for political parties or actors that seemed to threaten the status quo. While these challenges and concerns have been noted by media monitors through periodic daily and weekly reports and shared with stakeholders, there has been no observable attempt by the Electoral Commission to ensure that the media provide equitable, fair and balanced coverage of political processes. Media Monitors acknowledges the existence of a media monitoring committee for this election. However, the reports of this committee nor its recommendations are yet to be made public. Given the late stage of the electoral process, Media Monitors therefore recommends that 1. The media report all remaining processes that include voting, result tabulation and announcement in an accurate, fair and balanced manner. We also recommend that the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission urgently ensure that media complies with provisions of the Constitution, the Electoral Act, and media coverage regulations in the final stages of this election period. In the long term for future elections, there is an urgent need to align existing media laws with the Constitution to ensure that media freedom and freedom of expression are guaranteed and that they promote diversity and plurality of the sector. We also note the need for ZEC to ensure timely media monitoring in future elections and to set up adequate mechanisms to ensure compliance with provisions that promote fair, equitable and balanced coverage of political players. Finally, we recommend that media stakeholders continue to strengthen professional, ethical and accountable journalism in the interest of democracy. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patience. We'll take questions now. Yes.
Thank you very much, Media Monitors, for the comprehensive report. I was just wondering, what are the trends? Are there any changes happening from the last report that you presented, the baseline report that you presented? Any comparison that you can make between the two reports?
From the baseline report that we produced in February, there have been some changes, but they've been very minor. The trends remain pretty much the same. We have that predominance of ZANU-PF and the MDC alliance, and we have noted in subsequent reports that we have produced that the trend has been continuing from February, when we started monitoring to date. The main changes have been perhaps the intensity in which we have seen the negativity or the positivity of coverage of the different political parties. When we did our baseline in February, there was a lot less positive or negative sentiment that was attached to any of the political parties, and there have been attempts even on in the state broadcasters to present propositions by opposition players in a fair manner. But we have seen increased negativity as we are heading towards the election, especially in the election period, the last 5 or 6 weeks.
Any more questions? Yes.
Thank you. Over the last 2 weeks, in your daily update, you have indicated that there's been, in terms of coverage of political parties, it's tended to equal out. Is that still the case, or is ZANU-PF still getting the majority? Because I think in the last 2 weeks you had said that the other political parties now are coming up. I think it is coming down from a 13% share, it's going up to about 26-27%.
I guess with this report, we looked at an overall assessment. The trends have been shifting, where we found that there was a lot less time, especially on ZBC, that was allocated to ZANU-PF and the MDC alliance. But we note that in the whole period, this report covers the entire period from proclamation to the 22nd. You find then that's where you find the statistics coming up to about 50%. But this is because in the initial stages of the election period, ZANU-PF would get maybe 80% of coverage. And then maybe in the last 2 weeks, they would get 30%. So it kind of evens out to about 50% overall.
Any more questions? Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to find out whether negativity or positivity of a story matters more than the accuracy of it. What impact would that have on the overall?
I think the issue of positivity or negativity depends really on the situation. If there's been a negative event that occurred, definitely the presentation will be negative. But then the idea that what we've observed is that there's tended to be a focus on the negative aspects of a certain political party in the different media platforms, where you see that, let's say, coverage of a rally, there's been focus on the sound bites, the gaffes by the different political actors, and that's the news that you would get in the media, and that has contributed more to the negative coverage of the different political parties. So in a sense, the accuracy of it is really more of an issue than the negative.
Yes, Njabulo.
Yes. Have you sought clarification from the editors why they are behaving in the manner they are behaving? Because it would look like it's more of the same of what we got in 2008, 2013.
Well, we have engaged with editors at different platforms. Unfortunately, in this platform, I can't be able to give you the direct quotations, because a lot of these have been private conversations and private meetings that have been held, or internal meetings that I've had the privilege, or we've had the privilege of attending with the editors. However, there has been, like you said, there is this trend where sometimes in the media there have been issues around capture, and they've been widely talked about in the public sphere, where we have noted that editors have noted that there is capture in the media houses. We have journalists who are maybe in Shona, people would say munwaningi or vanwaningi. So it becomes an issue when they start reporting on the person that they are supporting, and perhaps opposition or people that don't support their particular viewpoint. So when you look at issues of capture, that has been one of the biggest challenges. And of course there have been issues around the capacity of the media itself, where we find that a lot of newsrooms are understaffed. They lost a lot of senior staff members, and some of the editors will actually tell you that we are working a lot with interns or junior staff members. And so in terms of quality control that goes into a lot of the stories, this has also been a challenge. So I can just indicate those as some of the issues, although there are several more.
Thank you.
What's your assessment of that response from editors? Is it just around the it's a true reflection? Because really, I mean, the issue of saying a reporter is captured is an editor, you have oversight over that, and you can exert your authority. So for me, I don't know, what do you think about that?
We are, of course, caught between a rock and a hard place. We do understand that there are challenges in the media sector, genuine challenges in terms of sustainability of the media, in terms of professionalism of the sector, the media laws themselves that have contributed to a lot of the situation that we have seen. However, I do agree with you that there has to be a lot more effort by the editors as the gatekeepers in the media houses to ensure that some of the things don't pass, you know, the gates, in terms of really ensuring that their policies are updated and ensure that they are able to recognize a lot of these issues when they happen. Sometimes perhaps the editor might not know perhaps that someone is captured. Maybe they're friends with somebody there, but I guess when you start seeing a persistent coverage, or maybe positive coverage against for someone, or persistent coverage against someone, you can be able to tell, and you can be able to put in place mechanisms that can be able to stop those practices.
Cindy, you had a question?
Yes, your earlier reports indicated that, I think when you started monitoring for this election, in some media houses there were actually zero representation of women in the coverage. Any shifts on that? I realized that there has been some kind of shift, but what would you say about that trend?
Okay. I will ask Preso to...
I think that has been a welcome trend. Initially, we noted that in the electronic media, there had been less coverage of women, but then as the electoral period progressed, we managed to observe that this has increased. But then it has been, there's been sports where we would not have any coverage of women. So in the end, there's there's been limited coverage of women overall.
Yes.
I think just a follow-up question. Last week, MISA issued a statement about the composition of the media, the ZEC Media Monitoring Committee. I wanted to hear your opinion as a player in that sector, because they queried the composition and said it's illegal, and you guys are saying you want them to produce timely reports. What, at an advocacy level, what's your opinion or position on that?
I think looking at the statement by MISA, they were looking at the legality of having the ZMC and the Broadcasting Authority as part of the Media Monitoring Committee. We would need to get more clarity from ZEC in terms of the composition of their committees, but from what I understand, ZEC has actually composed a Media Monitoring Committee that does get technical expertise from ZEC and BUS, but that is more a ZEC body. So I'm not quite sure how the Media Monitoring Committee is structured, and we need to get a bit more clarity before we can issue that kind of a comment. However, what we can say is that a lot of these issues need to be looked at law, and probably now might be too late to look at the legal aspects of how this monitoring committee is composed. It's going to be something that is going to be for the next election. How do we amend the laws to ensure that we don't have a lot of these gaps in terms of how the media is being monitored? And even the mechanisms in terms of ensuring compliance by ZEC have been somewhat limited. Even if they have their own independent monitoring committee, we haven't seen what they are doing and whether they've been receiving complaints, whether they have independently monitored the media, and how do they ensure compliance of media houses to the provisions that they have set.
Yes.
Are you also monitoring online media?
We are, however, we are not yet in a position to share the findings of online media and our monitoring. In terms of our online media, what you can expect from that is a lot around the kind of conversations that happen online and the sentiment that is expressed by different players online. Most of our discussion, of our monitoring on social media is going to be limited to Facebook and Twitter because of capacity challenges.
Yes.
You made reference to the fact that most of the coverage has been focused on the bigger players, that is ZANU-PF, then followed by MDC Alliance. I just wanted to know, do you interact with these political parties to get to know why these other players are not utilizing those advertising space or media space, because some of them are not visible on the ground?
We did have, we were part of an interaction between editors and political parties, and they were from ZANU-PF, MDC Alliance, PRC, and other political players, Code, etc., who were part of those discussions. And what they said was that the advertising space is too expensive, they can't afford it. So there have been those issues around their funding and how they can be able to fund the adverts. For example, on ZBC, they were saying it's just way beyond what they can be able to afford as political parties. So that's the reason they were saying they were not advertising. But another issue that came out strongly was that political parties themselves have not been able to market themselves adequately for them to get the coverage that they require. So recommendations were made around how they should actually improve their communication and media strategies so that they can get coverage by the media.
Yes.
Back to the issue of the ZEC Media Monitoring Committee. But you as a monitoring body, are you satisfied with the composition and looking at the roles that they're supposed to play, looking at the Electoral Act? Do you think they will satisfy or they will meet the standards that are required?
Unfortunately, we don't really know the exact composition. I know they are members of the committee, and there has been a lot of capacity building by the UNDP, for example. So the capacity might have improved. It's unfortunate that right now we don't have that information. We were told that this was composed. We have a media monitoring committee composed. We don't know the linkages between that committee by ZEC and the Broadcasting Authority and the ZMC, but what we can say is that it's there. But at the exact composition, we cannot comment on that.
Any more questions? Yes.
Last question, sorry. On the ZEC Media Monitoring Committees, have they started work?
I understand that they have. I think a lot of the questions around the Media Monitoring Committee should be directed at ZEC, and we would really love to see it in the media coming out. What has the Media Monitoring Committee done? It would really help our work as well, because we haven't been able to get that official comment from ZEC around how that committee is composed and what work they are doing. We would have unofficial lines of communication, but it's not anything that I can be able to present to the public.
If there aren't any questions, thank you so much, colleagues. This report will be available on the Media Monitors website, mediamonitors.org.zw. Thank you so much. Yes, but we have copies that we'll share before we go.